Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be doing this digital presentation as a part of Waffle Games 7.0. My name is Josh Hirschfield. I'm an adjunct professor at both NYU and Pratt, where I teach game design and development. Today's talk is going to be dynamic documentation, building documentation you'll actually use. And let's jump right in. So what are we talking about today? What is dynamic documentation? We will go over that, and we'll discuss the ins and outs of how it works, what it is, and how it compares to normal documentation. We'll also be looking at how we build it. So we'll be going through some abstract steps so that you can take this talk and hopefully generate ideas for how you can more relatively or individualistically build different documentation sets for your team. And then we'll be going over a few smaller aspects that I think are pretty key to this form of documentation: the single source of truth, living documents, and live channels. And as it says at the bottom, some things will be fairly abstract just so we can keep the talk moving, because we do have a limited time here. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me after. And if there's a live chat right now and I'm available during this, I will for sure be able to answer any questions that you have during the talk as well. So let's jump right in. Conventionally, what is documentation? This is something that I think that every game developer actually has interacted with before. Any game developer or designer, we use game engines, we use Unity, we use Godot, we use Unreal, and they all have documentation, and they have scripting APIs and things like that. And this documentation is here to teach us how to use the engine. It's here to give us information. It's typically the what, how, and why. It's written on a wiki. It's static information. And it's updated, but in generally large updates. It's very standard. It's very helpful. They sometimes give examples. But generally speaking, we only visit these things once in a blue moon to visit a specific function or figure something out. And then we don't really interact with this further. So when we make documentations for our teammates, when we make different kinds of documentation for our teammates, we should be doing something more live. We should be doing something more helpful. So what's wrong with conventional documentation? There's a laundry list of things. It's difficult to navigate, so finding things is difficult. It's very hard to do that and apply to specific problems, especially if it's not maintained. Usually, it's only referred to when somebody has a problem. So if you have a problem, you're looking at the Unity documentation. Typically, people are not actually sitting and reading the documentation unless you're like me and you're insane. It's also rarely interesting to process, right? It can be really difficult to read, lots of jargon and lots of phrases that if you're not familiar with what you're talking about, can be very, very difficult to process. Many people consider static documentation a waste of time because many people will rarely read it. I've been on lots of projects where we have lots and lots of pages of documentation, but only a few people are familiar with it because it's a lot to read. And then finally, it's difficult to know about any updates or changes, especially in large knowledge databases when there's not that much of a presence, I suppose, or an update channel. In most cases, with large static documentation, you don't really see much of a difference or change until you find one. So what's good about dynamic documentation? Well, it requires less effort to build, maintain, and navigate. We refer to it frequently, which means that we are incredibly familiar and understand the majority of the knowledge in that base. It's also much lighter to process and engage with, so it's easier to digest. We can use it in several ways to automatically create detailed elements, which we can frequently refer to. And when built properly, you can have automated updates and notifications so you understand the changes and additions of new information. So what is dynamic documentation? Well, it's very similar to static documentation. Conventionally, when you build a document, right, you write a page, put it online, and people read it. With dynamic documentation, information is never final, right? Things are being added constantly. It's always changing. You use dynamic forms of media to portray non-static information, right? So we are constantly changing things, so we're using specifically dynamic forms of media. And we also have information which can be put into a pre-organized framework. So we know where everything is, and we can add more information as we go. I have two simple examples at the bottom. On the left is a simple notion homepage with links to different parts of my graduate thesis, which I worked on about 2 years ago. And this is fairly simple to read. You can see where everything is. Nothing's final. You can check all of these documents. They're still in production, some of them. And all of this is non-static. So I can change, delete, rearrange, and it's all pre-organized. Each of these documents has a specific orientation and organization. On the bottom right, there is another example of dynamic information where I have a compendium of game design information. And that is a Trello board available for free to anybody. It's public. And this is only a small segment of it. I believe there's 7 columns in there. But the final one has around 40 or 50 columns. When I add a new card, when I find something new that I think is helpful and I want to keep or I want to share with someone else, I add it to the board. When I do that, a small notification will appear or an update will appear when you look at the page and it says that I added a new card. That card is pre-organized, so all the information associated with it is going to be filled out, just as I have done for every other card. It's non-static, so I can move it or change it if somebody says, this is a better card, or I'd like to replace that source with something else. And the information is never final. So if the author updates it, then I can replace it, right? And that has allowed me to build a very large compendium of lots of different tutorials, art styles, different kinds of drawing styles, animation tutorials, stuff like that, really, that is just helpful in all facets of game design and development. So let's go through each of those points more specifically. So what does never final actually mean? So games are incredibly complex and abstract, and our perceptions of them are constantly changing, right? If anybody's been in a game design meeting, you know how hard it is to portray ideas to one another. Our documentation should reflect this, and we should rewrite it and reread it often. Below is an example of a document that I started a while ago. It was one of the first documents within my knowledge base that I had written about procedural animation. And I had written a first draft a long time ago to showcase each aspect for myself and for my teammates. And then I rewrote it so many times that I actually turned it into an article. And it's public now, and you can go read it. But I must have rewritten that about 4 or 5 times in total, and removed and added sections, which constantly had me rewriting and rereading it often. So we can actually rewrite some of our documentation automatically. We can offload some of our different things, some of our different parts of our development workflow, so that we can automatically generate and build more effective documentation. So we can lower the time we engage with it and maximize the time that we output information. So in this case, whenever I created a new build or a new tag in GitHub, I was able to then consolidate the majority of the commits into a small changelog. I would add a few notes, write down some highlights, and then allow software to actually build the rest. So on my Notion, I had a feed for build and patch notes, and whenever a new build was released, it would sync with the GitHub build releases page, and voila, I had automatically written documentation. And because it's written often, it can be reread often and very easily. I have a Discord channel within the Discord server where I work on my game, and I do this in several different servers, where I have a webhook from GitHub, send a message whenever a new commit is done. So people know what I'm working on at that time, and people know what I'm doing, they know how it works, stuff like that. It's been remarkably useful in the context of development, and I highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in this kind of faster, readable documentation. On the right is a public itch.io changelog, which also uses this kind of idea. I do some consolidation of the different commit names and removing ones that are not sort of public, and I go over them to make sure that it's readable and it makes sense. But this is a really easy thing to reread, right? Just from looking at this, you can understand the changes that have been made in a second. The more frequently your team rewrites and rereads your dynamic documentation, the more up-to-date they will be. This seems obvious, but it's true. If you're rewriting and rereading your documentation automatically or by hand, you're going to have an easier time moving forward with your project. Dynamic documentation should be non-static. So that means 3 separate things. The first is that there should always be a two-way conversation. Both the author and the reader should have the ability to talk to one another in some form. Whether that's a comment, a reaction, an edit, a suggestion, you need to have some way to create communication. The more mutable documentation is, the more accessible it is. Mutable meaning changeable to different forms. If you can't change it from one form to another, it will make it more difficult for your team to leverage it and utilize it. It should also be incredibly easy to follow. So in many cases, you should not have to dig to find your desired answer. If you are taking way too much time to find what you need, it's going to be difficult to use your documentation. Let's go through these individually. For conversations to be two-way, we need to make sure that when we build something or when we're using something, the environment has to yield that. So if you have a one-way environment, like a web page or a wiki page, there is no place for questions to go on that page. There are no reactions. There are no suggestions. So you end up getting a Discord message, or a Slack message, which can be annoying, but it seems to be the only way. In this example, I have a Notion board in which there are a series of tasks. And then on the right side, people will mention me or change the tasks. And when that happens, I get a notification and I can review it. So if somebody's leaving a comment or asking me a question or making an edit, it's incredibly easy to follow. I don't have to go digging. I don't have to find things. It's all built in right there. Another example that I like to use here for documentation that should be incredibly easy to follow. This is one excerpt of a larger board. This is about maybe 1/8 of the board that I'm showing here, so it's quite big. And throughout it, there are lots of drawn notes, sticky notes, comments, you name it. It's a collection of different artwork for references. And as you can see, there are a series of different bubbles representing comments that other users have given. On the right middle there's two icons next to one another, one of me and one of my colleagues, and there was a message dropped. And inside here, I wrote a comment that talked about the lighting. And one of the people I'm working with then said, "Yeah, I dig the lighting." This is incredibly easy to follow. I don't have to go digging very far. I get a notification when this comes up, so I know exactly where to look. The program will direct me to it, and it's easy to follow. Finally, it should always be mutable. Dynamic documentation should always be mutable. In many cases, I have one form of documentation that is a specific form or structure. On the left, there is a development log for internal use that is about 10 minutes long, which is much easier to build than a long document that nobody will read. I would make videos for my team and members that I was working with or collaborating with so that they could more easily and more quickly grasp concepts that might take a little too long to read and explain. It's much easier to show rather than tell. Those can then be turned into audio files. So if you want to play it on your phone, or if a specific section wants to be an audio clip on an image or a GIF, I can actually add that to a page where I have maybe an animation playing and I have a short audio clip that says an explanation for 10 seconds of what's going on in there. And if that's not enough, I can then translate that automatically. YouTube has an automatic service for a transcription. I can have that there as well. So it's incredibly accessible. It's incredibly easy to use. Basically, any format that you want can come from this one format. So your documentation should be mutable. So it should also always be easy to follow. This is another example of that same idea. So the video explanations are easy to follow, flowcharts are easy to follow, and automated updates are easy to follow. And none of these, you might have to jump back and forth in the video, but that transcript is going to help, and those specific examples are going to help. So this both means in the moment and throughout the project, right? It should be easy to follow in the moment. It should be a linear presentation of information that you don't get confused by. But it also means that you shouldn't have to really spend too much time throughout the entire project to understand where the team is at and where the team is going. When you have consistent two-way communication in mutable environments, documentation becomes incredibly easy to follow. So it should be pre-organized as well. There's two main factors for how you build knowledge into your database or your knowledge base. You should have a pre-organized form, and then the more you conform to that form, the easier the documentation will be to navigate and utilize. So on the left, bottom left, I have a bug report sample. So this format is given to all bugs in the game, and people use it to report bugs and add it and give you all these different kinds of pieces of information about it, what versions it affects, the state it's in, the intended result. the actual result, and severity, all this stuff. And because we're using the same bug report sample over and over, and not just having sort of like a paragraph fill in the blank kind of thing, you can very easily and quickly discern this. Now, this is not something new. This is just fits in very well with the pre-organization of dynamic documentation. On the bottom right is a game design macro, and it's just sort of formatted in a way that I really like, where there's an introduction, the main idea, and then you dive into the content. And I do this for all the articles that I write in my wiki. They're all formatted the same way so that they're very easy to read and process because you build a sort of design language within your documentation. And here's an example of that. So all of these articles conform to the same structure. They all explain how they work. They all follow the same flow. And if you're a good writer, then you know how important this kind of thing is. It's also nice to read them, right? Following that flow and conforming to one another makes them much, much more digestible. Each paragraph is not too long, right? Sentences aren't too advanced. They're not too complex. I avoid using incredibly big words because this has to be able to go to anyone, and anyone has to read it quickly and easily and understand what I'm talking about. Making sure it's easy to navigate is another important aspect of this too. This is the section from the beginning of the talk, but it has served me very, very well. It might seem simple and straightforward, but that's because it is. It's not advanced. I don't have to have too many links. These are all the things I quickly need to access all of the time. And within these, there may be one or two links, but they're at the top of the document. So if I need something specific, I can always search for it, or maybe 2 clicks away. Pre-organized documentation, which conforms to itself, makes it incredibly easy to read and navigate. So if you are building new articles and you're doing them in the same structure as old articles, you will be able to write them more quickly, read them more quickly, and move through them more quickly. So if you need to jump to a specific part of your article, you can open it, scroll all the way down, and say, this is exactly what I need. And people have made fun of me because I've been doing this so much that when I have a thought and say, oh man, I did this thing in my game, it's just like what you're talking about. The joke that people make, they make fun of me for it. It's not really a joke. They just make fun of me for it. Is that I can open my phone, I can click on a random article, and I can scroll really fast, and then I can find the thing that I want to show them. But I think that proves that if it conforms and it's pre-organized, you can navigate it really easily. So these are your 3 main ideas for this section of the talk. And I would take a screenshot of this or take a photo. I know a lot of people will be taking photos throughout, but this is one of the main areas in which you might want to take this with you. And we'll be applying this forward in the next section of the talk as well to discuss more specific aspects of how they work. So how do we actually build with these things? How do we build it? How do we build this documentation? You have to choose the right tools. So obviously you should use the tools that meet your team's specific needs. They're the most comfortable for everyone to use. And we have our 3 rules here. So easy to rewrite and reread, 2-way communication, mutable environment, conformity, and navigation. And I have 4 major tools which represent the majority of my own experience working in different types of production software and game design software, which are Google Drive, Obsidian, Trello, and Notion. But there are hundreds of tools that you could use for this. These are just the 4 that I've used the most and I find to be the most popular. So I figured I would include them in the talk. So, of course, this wouldn't be a Josh Hirschfield talk without a graph. So how do we actually build? All right. So first criteria is easy to rewrite and reread. So this might seem obvious, but it's not a given, right? We have classic forms of documentation, such as whiteboards or notebooks. And that's a war room in the very middle. And then we have all of our technical stuff. So immediately we can see that the technical work, including GitHub Docs, is already much more rereadable and rewritable than something like a whiteboard. But that whiteboard is just as erasable and rewritable as Obsidian or Notion or Google Drive. You can erase it very quickly. The problem is that it's gone when it's erased. So you'll have to take photos, which makes it harder to reread because you'll have to transcribe that. Notebook on the bottom there is pretty rereadable, but only to you because they're your notes. And it's not very rewritable, especially if you use pen. And sure, there's an argument for whiteout, but I think whiteout is not a blank cover-all solution. The war room in the middle is a sticky note featured environment. And the idea here is that you're building different columns and swim lanes so that you can follow your project throughout its calendar. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be a part of, and it helps, but it's usually supplemental to other main forms of documentation. for two-way communication in a mutable environment, I found there was actually a gradient. So in this case, Notion, Google Drive, and Obsidian, as well as Google Docs, kind of have this almost linear line. And Notion is incredibly high in communication. There are lots of ways to leave comments, leave descriptions, mention one another. Just everything is great there. But it's not mutable. It's very hard. Recently, Notion removed the option to transcribe their pages into Markdown, which I thought was very strange. Then you can see on the bottom left, we have our whiteboard, our notebook, and our war room, which make it harder to communicate on them because it's very cluttered in a war room. And whiteboards, I guess you could leave messages, but people might not see them. But they're not mutable, right? They can't be changed into other things. Google Drive is pretty good. It's up there. It's definitely the best scoring on average for this because you can leave comments, you can save documents as different types, but ultimately it's not the best for both. GitHub Docs is very mutable, and there are some comment sections in it, so it's gotten a little bit of points of communication, but it's not great. Obsidian is all the way in mutability. You can basically turn that information to anything you want, but there's no room for communication. I've removed the conventional forms of documentation here and focused on the digital ones. So how do we build it? This allows you to conform and, navigate, right? We have to conform and navigate. And I did not include Trello on these because I think that it's very specifically a Kanban board. I swapped it out with GitHub Docs. But in this case, you can see that Google Drive and conformability, pretty okay. Like if you are cool with using Google Docs and spreadsheets and presentations, that's great, but you have to conform to that. But navigation-wise, it's pretty terrible, right? Hyperlinks are fine, but even in Google Drive, I feel that hyperlinks are pretty limiting. GitHub Docs is pretty good. Conformability is pretty high. Navigation is pretty high because you can build a lot of different types of Markdown hyperlinks and embedded hyperlinks and stuff like that. But it's very hard to build your own type of conformability. Notion and Obsidian were neck and neck here. Both of them have these very robust navigation and embedding frameworks. And you're basically in both of them designing your own small website for your team. So I went ahead and averaged out the scores, and each of these has a strength and a weakness. Google Drive was pretty all right on average, but had terrible navigation. GitHub Docs has okay stuff overall, but not great communication. Notion is incredibly strong, but has no mutability, and Obsidian is almost 10s across the board, but has no communication whatsoever. So basically what I gathered from all of this and have been doing in all of these different projects and making dynamic documentation and different things like that is that Notion is great for building in groups because it is basically just a website builder with information that is constantly changing and mutable and will notify you when it changes. Whereas Obsidian is the best across the board, but there's no communication. So you have really nice solo use, but when you have a group work or when you have like a team of people that needs to work as a group, they have to be tech savvy. Otherwise, you're not going to have a good time. There's no built-in communication tools. Notion, you can leave comments, you can leave highlights, you can make notifications, you can leave messages. Google Drive has suggestion mode and comments mode as well. And GitHub Docs has the comment section, but Obsidian is just Markdown pages. So it can be quite difficult to delineate comments and ideas from the actual content. So another thing that I'd like to talk about is the single source of truth. So this is a concept that many people seem to not know about. But the idea is that you take a service like Miro or Figma and you put all of your information onto it for people to see. And the idea is that you eliminate this moment of what do we want to do for this area or how do we want to draw that? What's the lighting like for this? Like you have all of that available. So when a question is asked and it can't be answered by the single source of truth, you add more information to it. This is the largest single source of truth that I've used in any case. It features timelines, screenshots, comments, structures, concept art, presentations, map designs, character designs, you name it. As we get closer and zoom in on it, you can see that in this case, every single time I had a question or a creative challenge, I added another section, another arrow, and I went ahead and I created another sticky note. So whenever somebody asked me a question, I would try and find it in here. If I couldn't find it in here, I would add another sticky note. And that was really, really helpful. There were also a series of playtesting notes. So if I wanted to review something, I was able to quickly pull this up and find playtesting notes or different ideas, then move through them. That tracker on the right, not frame one, but the thing left to it, was a series of different issues that I was tracking for the playtest. So if a bug came up, I would be able to log it there. If it didn't come up, I would move it away. And if there was something changed about it, I would make a note. So I had everything available here, especially for other people working on the project. There were also map designs here. So this way, if I was doing 3D modeling or 3D work, I could reference each aspect of the map design. So going left to right, on the left we had different definitions, different ideas, different concepts, things that I was writing down, what areas had to be there, how each of those areas worked. And that big long column in the middle with the big white columns, the one side by side, I had each area individually outlined and described specifically for the map. Then there's the large red to the one that has red at the top and white at the bottom. That's a gradient of difficulty explaining which room each one of those was. And then on the right, we had the core concepts of each environment. So that I was able to present this as sort of more of a map design perspective rather than a game just overview. This is a single source of truth for a board game I'm working on. It's still in concept and the art is still development work. But the core idea here is that you can see everything you need to see and everything you need to know right in front of you. You have, in the top left, you have the rules, every single page, every single set, every diagram. The second row, you have every single card and the reasoning behind their design. The third row is the printout format for the game, and the fourth row is the half printouts for different boards and 2 digital print forms. So if you wanted to put it into Tabletop Simulator or a different kind of software, you could. The next thing I'd like to discuss is a living document. So these are writing spaces where the content is updated all the time by the team. The idea is that you are not ever going to leave these alone. You're going to come back to them more and more. These are pages like your game design or your narrative, different aspects that can help you make your game faster and more easily. When you add something to it, you may have to manually notify your team. But when you do, make a note at the top of the document and say, oh, this was written by me on this date. I updated this on that date, and things like that. So that way, when people look at the document, they understand the context in which it was written and don't think, oh, this is brand new, or think, oh, this is incredibly old. I have found that this creates an incredibly strong basis for communication in smaller bursts between team members. And even though it's a small thing, it helps living documents stay active and helps people understand when they were last interacted with. I also like this concept of the live channel. I do this with the majority of people that I work with, both professionally and as a hobbyist. Consistently taking videos and uploading images of things that I'm working on allows me to show people and say, is this what you had in mind? Should I continue in this direction? Asking questions, delivering answers, and helping people move the project forward using this method has proven to be one of the most successful and helpful versions of dynamic documentation that I can find. This has avoided meetings, this has avoided emails. A quick message in Slack or Discord with an image and a description has yielded me higher and higher amounts of effective production time. So there's a lot of challenges and pitfalls, but I know we're running low on time, so I'll keep this short. Make time to catch up with your team. Make time for them to catch up with the documentation. They should have time and energy during the day to do this. Give them 10 to 15 minutes to catch up on all their notifications. It'll help them stay in touch with the documentation itself. Don't ignore channels. It's really easy to mute a channel on Discord or mute a channel on Slack, leave them up, or maybe ignore them only outside of work hours. This way you know what you have to check up on. I'm guilty of that too, by the way. Ensure that everybody's heard and understood. So this kind of documentation is essentially constant communication, which with that comes a constant need for respect. So communication is the strongest tool in your toolbox, but you have to listen, you have to respect one another with that. Also, don't give in to the urge to change tools mid-production. It's really tempting because you'll find a lot of problems with the tools that you have, the ones that you start with. And halfway through you might say, wow, it would be so much better if we switched to Notion. It'd be so much better if we used Obsidian. I wish we were using Miro. But if you swap, you're going to find huge hurdles are going to come on upon you and you'll have to get over them. And that slows down your production time and it makes it more difficult because everyone just learned this new software. So don't change. Change at the end. And run retrospectives. They'll actually save your life. See what people have to say, see what problems come up, and see what you can do in the future. And use that to leverage your dynamic documentation. So I hope this helped. I hope this sparked ideas. I'm excited to see your questions. I'd love to talk about this more. It's something that I haven't really seen talked about in games because dynamic documentation is a thing that I believe only exists in games. So I'd be curious to hear anybody's thoughts on the topic. So none of this should be taken as a fact. These are all just my opinions, and it's basically all theory that I've been using to be a more effective producer. So please speak your own mind and tell me if you think something is good or bad or why. Please be critical. All of the resources in this talk, including the talk itself, are my own and are available for public educational use under a Creative Commons non-commercial license. You also do not have to attribute to that license, or to me. If you would like access to anything mentioned in this talk, please let me know, and I'd be happy to give it to you. Thanks so much. It's time for questions. So I will be, I believe, in the chat. There's about 10 minutes allocated for that. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn. It's my full name, Josh Hirschfield. My Discord name is Josh. It is actually just Josh. My public notifications and friend requests in Discord are not open, but if you are part of the EGD server or friends with somebody who's friends with me, you can send me a friend request. Just please note and say that you do, in fact, know me from this talk and you'd love to connect. Or you can just send me an email. I'd be happy to connect there as well. So thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I hope this talk was helpful, and I look forward to hearing from you.